Good morning, everyone. Morning, colleagues in the room and colleagues online. Thank you for joining us today. Our speaker is Dr. Selina Valian. She's a senior
One,
research.
2, 3, 4.
Has nothing to use themselves. Thank you. So Dr. Valiani is a senior researcher here at the Southern Center. She's the author of the research monograph, Thinking and Equal Exchange, the Global Integration of Massive Labor Markets and the Africa Care Economy Index. She has also published on financialization in Africa, the political economy of development, feminist economics, and in a range of journals, policy speakers, and podcasts. She'll be speaking for about 45 minutes-ish, and then we'll have a Q&A session after. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning to people online. I'm really excited to be here. Some friend of mine posted this morning, every speech should start, the shorter the speech, the longer the applause. So that is my challenge today, because I was lobbying Arabo yesterday for more time as I was seeing how long this presentation is. It's an exciting topic for me because I'm talking about all of my mentors that I studied with directly and indirectly. And it is a conversation that started in Africa, but is very rarely referred to nowadays. So this is the title of the presentation, and you can go to the next screen, which is also the title of the paper that I am speaking from. Today, I could only get to the first section. So please do read the paper, take some time, and please stay in touch with me, because maybe we can discuss it as you get into the debates. So I start the paper with a Facebook post that I read in 2019 from Tsepo Madligosi, who's a well-known legal scholar and now also a commissioner, as you would know, in the South African Human Rights Commission. No liberation is victorious. Discuss. And that really made me think about Samir Amin's Problématique, which in amended form would be no liberation thus far has been victorious. So when we look at the work of Samir Amin in his ranging voices as a scholar, as a policy analyst, as an activist strategist, he's constantly thinking about this question: human liberation, whether it is about what we call now the global South, whether it's rich countries, whether it's communist countries, former communist countries. This generally expresses what he is thinking about and problematizing. So popular as well as intellectual debates. But what I argue in the paper is that we cannot talk about Samir Amin without talking about his interlocutors as well, the key interlocutors. So that'll be the first section of the paper. And then toward the end, I'll get to world historical thought and knowledge for liberation today, because these discussions started a while ago. These are some of the works that I will introduce to you. Please go and read these books as well. My paper and this are really just a wetting of the tongue. I argue in the paper that Samir Amin's work sparked world systems analysis, or what is also known as world historical thought. This is a framework, it's a methodology, it's a theoretical framework that is post-Marxist. What that means is that it draws on Marx's methodology of historical materialism and some of his theoretical constructs, but without reifying Marx's thought as a reading of world history. So passing through Marx, economic history, standard economics, historical sociology, and even international relations theory, the world systems frame is eclectic, both theoretically and methodologically. As I said, I am a student of many of the scholars I will discuss, a lifelong student. And so I will try to give you some insight about their lives as well, these thinkers' lives and how it connects to their thinking. So let's go to part one, understanding the whole. That's how I begin the paper. And this really is the subject matter of world systems thought. So it is particularly relevant today, I think, with the combined ecological and socioeconomic crisis that we face in the world. And at the same time, the post-structuralist, postmodern wave is waning in the academy. So there's a growing interest to understanding the global, understanding world capitalism. And I propose that world systems thought has a lot to offer there. Intellectuals of the majority world, beginning in the 1960s, were, I think, part of the spark for this framework, and Samir Amin was one of them. In the 60s and early 70s, what these intellectuals, mainly in Africa and Latin America, were responding to is the modernization theory of the 1950s coming out of Europe. So the modernization approach is basically a reading of the development of what we used to call Western countries, now we call them Northern countries, devoid of political and historical analysis of the mechanisms underlying wealth accumulation in the rich world. From here, they were drawing up economistic development models for the majority world, particularly in Asia and Africa, which were now becoming independent of colonial rule after long struggles, and even referring to Latin America that had become independent about 100 years earlier. So Walter Rodney's work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was a response to modernization theory as applied to Africa, for instance. But there were many other works as well. Read the paper and you will see. There's Aníbal Quijano's work, there's Samir Amin's work, Giovanni Arrighi, some of whom then formed the Gang of Four in the mid-1970s. You may have heard of the Gang of Four. Anybody? Okay. This was Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, and Andre Gunder Frank. So Andre Gunder Frank was living in Latin America, a German, and he was part of what Amin calls a new globalized economic structure that was becoming perceptible in the 1970s. So while you had the Walter Rodneys and others who were discussing modernization theory and the notion basically that many countries in Africa or elsewhere in the majority world had a path of development that was largely shaped from the colonial period. And so they would trace the relations between two countries, right? The southern country and the northern. And what Amin means when he says the new globalized economic structure was that actually what was affecting those southern countries was a whole lot of other relations going on within the rich world and maybe even within the South. And so they started thinking, the Gang of Four, of this international realm much more. So Giovanni Arrighi and Emanuel Wallerstein, an Italian and a US American, came to Africa. They came to the University College of Dar es Salaam. They came to the University College of Nyasaland, and they heard about these critiques of modernization theory. And what they did is they brought them into their own analytical question around the structures of hegemony in the world economy. So the leading European forces that formed what they called capitalism as a historical system. So this is the idea that this system gradually built countries into a core of the world system, semi-periphery, and periphery. From about 1492, the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. So the best known work here is probably that of Emanuel Wallerstein that you see in the middle, the yellow, called The Modern World System. That came out in 1974. The theoretical framing used by Emanuel Wallerstein, though, is drawn from L'accumulation à l'échelle mondiale, which was written by Samir Amin in 1970. In that book, you see it on the left, Samir Amin defines le système capitaliste mondial, okay? The global world system. In it, here's a quick way of describing that, right? That Marx's categories of bourgeoisie and proletariat can be mapped to nations of the globe rather than simply classes within states. Another big concept from Amin's book is transfers of value. So these transfers occurred from what was called the underdeveloped countries at the time to the developed. And he argues that this is the essence of capitalist accumulation on a world scale. These transfers can be hidden, and they take varying forms in different parts of the majority world, right? Because what Europeans found around the world were different production systems. So using, again, a Marxian term, Amin argues that there were varying forms of primitive accumulation. If you read the paper, you will see the difference between how Marxists use that term and how Amin does. Now, this notion of transfer builds on Amin's 1955 PhD thesis, which traces surplus production in colonial Egypt. What he argues is that, and demonstrates, is that it's not a lack of surplus value that is happening in countries of the majority world, but the use of it is in ways that are not economically and socially productive for the majority. So he shows that between 1939 and 1953, 1/3 of national income was surplus, was profit. He uses existing statistics, right? But only 14% of this was reinvested productively in Egypt. What is productive? Well, family businesses, stocks, shares of various sorts. 38% of the surplus, he shows, was used in luxury consumption, and 15% in liquid capital, so gold and other speculative forms. He further argues in the book that forms and uses of surplus in post-colonial countries vary with the nature of social formations and the mechanisms of integration into the capitalist world system during and even prior to formal colonialism. So formal colonialism happens in the late 19th century, but these processes began long before. Therefore, he argues there is a need for historical explanation of the genesis of the world capitalist system, from which a theory of the international division of labor can be constructed. This is a task that is still remaining. Amin worked on it, but it's there for all of us to continue. Amin points out that Lenin's 1917 work on imperialism traced the form of monopoly capital in rich countries, and Baran and Sweezy's 1966 work called Monopoly Capital updates it to the 20th century, but without studying the transformations in the periphery, okay, those outer rims in the blue circles. So in the majority world, and connecting them over time in relation to the transformations of the core, the very middle. If this work were done, we could arrive at a theory of capitalist formations, and this would allow us to understand the forms of transfer from the majority world and core transformations over time. So no, we're fine. I'm really asking you to do work here, just thinking, not reading. So let's come back now to Immanuel Wallerstein's modern world system. What is he doing there? He picks up on Amin's notion of the historical origins of the world system, but much less on the question of the mechanisms by which the variety of majority world social formations were integrated into the global division of labor. Wally, as we used to call him in Binghamton, Immanuel Wallerstein also weaves together a wide range of separately told histories. So this was innovative in the early 70s. Because, of course, the assumption in sociology, Immanuel Wallerstein was a sociologist, was that things like tribes, communities, nation states are total systems closed in and of themselves. And what he argues is that from a certain point in the history of the world economy, please come and join us, please sit, that these all became part of a modern world system. So from the moment of early modern Europe, 15th century. In the book, The Modern World System, he demonstrates that this started in the early 16th century. This was the beginnings of world capitalism. And this was increasingly being recognized in the 70s as a system that was stretching the entire globe. He's quite clear, both in the original version and in the subsequent editions where he does new forewords or introductions, that the system was not global as we know it today from the onset. It wasn't even as global as they were seeing in the 70s in the onset. So parts of the world were gradually brought in. The key aspect of these relations is unequal exchange. Another concept to study. But let's go now to Fernand Braudel and the Annales School. This is a historical approach of France, 1950s, and it influenced Emmanuel Wallerstein, Samir Amin, Giovanni Arrighi. Some concepts from the Annales school, especially Fernand Braudel. The work of tracing history is tracing the confluence of conjoncture. I'm using some French words because they mean something different than their direct translations in English. A conjoncture is a rhythm of life and growth of things like science, technology, institutions, even concepts. And a confluence of conjoncture, meaning parallel processes, is what is key to trace, to understand structures of history. So it's the slow flow of these parallel processes. It's different, as I said, from the English conjuncture, which is what? Many things meeting at one point or a moment. Different, a different notion. These structures then are of the longue durée. Longue durée in French means not long term, but a long period of time, decades, even centuries. And Braudel is clear that these parallel processes then transcend simply social and economic conjuncture. So it's got to be more than that. Giovanni Arrighi in the 1980s takes this notion. He was also at the State University of New York in Binghamton with Emmanuel Wallerstein, which is where I studied. Combines the notion of conjoncture from Braudel to Braudel's concept of 3 tiers of economy. He also brings in a reconfigured notion of hegemony from Antonio Gramsci. What are the 3 tiers of economy à la Braudel? The bottom tier is material life. This is the soil into which capitalism thrusts its roots. The middle tier is market economy, okay? Horizontal communications between markets, generally governed by supply and demand. I think standard economics looks at this tier and this tier only, largely. But the top tier is the anti-market. And that is where the state and the largest of capitals come together to supersede the market. They use monopoly powers. What are these monopoly powers? Monopoly over the means of violence, that would be states, and monopoly over the means of production, a well-known term from Marx. Arrighi argues that the anti-market is key to capitalism as a world system, and that's in the long 20th century. The book you see there. Arrighi argues this meshing in the anti-market only happened in Europe. States and capitalist enterprise came together, and this propelled European states into the territorial conquering of the world. He traces 4 systems of accumulation. To the image. These are the structures of the world system in Arrighi's view, and each, great, oh. Okay, systemic cycles of accumulation, right? They are composed of 2 phases. The first phase in each is material expansion. So that is what you see. Okay, Let's try to interpret this. You look at the solid lines, they are stretching over what he calls the long 15th and 16th century, long 17th, long 19th, and then the long 20th century. Each of these are hegemonies. So the longue durée of hegemonies. And one rich country dominates in each of these periods. So the first one is Genoese merchants and bankers combining with the Spanish monarchy. Okay, and what happened in that period? You had a phase of material expansion, the M to C. That's also from Marx, money to commodities. And the second phase is of financial expansion, commodities to M1, more money. In a material expansion, what happens is that the largest capitals are invested in productive economic activity. This allows for a steady period of growth with fairly steady social relations. Of course, there are contradictions, right? Because we're talking about capitalism. So ultimately, those contradictions explode. That system comes to its limit. And then we move into a period of financial expansion. What happens there is that the largest capitals pull money out of commodity production and into largely speculative activity. That is the moment we are currently living in the fourth cycle. I won't be able to talk much about that today, but basically we can trace these material expansions followed by financial expansions over the four systemic cycles. They look different in each case. They must be defined historically, which he does in the long 20th century, but again, from the perspective of the hegemon. So what Arrighi does is he looks at the key parts of the majority world that were relevant for each cycle of accumulation. We can imagine what those are. I mean, the first cycle is silver of the Americas, and it is the spices of the so-called Far East. So there's an example. Yes, as I said, there's one hegemon in the lead, but the rest of the core, the rest of the rich countries of that historical moment support that hegemon. Let's go to the next slide. The next big work that I want to talk about is published in 1989 by Janet Abou-Lugold, Before European Hegemony. So Lugold is arguing that it's Eurocentric to root the development of merchants and bankers and organized processes of work and production, which is what happens in the material expansions, to European culture. So she wants to trace how these social phenomena existed prior to the modern world system. And she argues then for the ancient world system that extended between 1250 and 1350, as you see in the title of the book. She argues that there are 8 subsystems within the ancient world system. They all involve production, trade, and finance, and they are linked through 3 major circuits. The Middle East, as she calls it, the Far East, and the Western European. She argues that the high sophistication of the Genoese and the Venetian merchants was due to their contact with the East. You can see her take on Eurocentrism there, right? And that in the East, there was surplus produced. It was through organized production systems with the participation of states. So after sparking this huge discussion, right, over a few decades, Samir Amin comes back in and brings a totally new twist. Amin says that in the ancient world system, there was one dominant mode, which was the tributary mode of production. So again, playing on Marx's terms, mode of production. So the ancient world system was guided or was shaped by the tributary mode, which is what? It's based on surplus production of peasants with a tributary class that uses that to develop its power, based usually on a dominant ideology. What's an example of that? The biggest one would be religion. He argues that there was very little centralization of surplus on a global scale, and that each of these regions that Abu Lughod identifies were largely self-sufficient. Okay, so that's the tributary mode. And the major difference to the modern world system then is that the modern world system is dominated by the capitalist mode of production. It is based on free labor, so the idea of free labor, whether workers are free or not, and the ideology of economism, not a religion, not ideas other than economism arising from the worldwide law of value. This law operates on a truncated market, integrating goods and capital globally, but not labor. So it's a truncated market. Surplus is centralized, but world regions are polarized while still relating to each other. Amin's notion of Eurocentrism comes from this material conception of the world. He says that during ancient world system, there were outliers. They were not relating to the empires of China, India, Africa, and West Asia. And that was Western Europe, what he calls the Europe of the barbarians, and Japan. These outliers were characterized by a late development of the state, and this took form in absolute monarchies. Rather than combining themselves, these late states, with tributary classes, as in the ancient world system, which didn't exist, they combined with the rising bourgeoisie. Both of these then strengthened themselves through peasants that were being dispossessed, right? The enclosure movements, for example, in England, and being drawn into the market, the capitalist market. Therefore, it is Western European states and Japan that become the core of the modern world system. And rather than that being due to their cultural superiority, which is a notion that continues in our day, it is actually a product of their backwardness and historical contingency. The merging of late states in Western Europe with the rising merchants and bankers occurred in tandem with a cultural revolution happening in Europe that shifted the generation of ideas away from religion and metaphysics to to economism, right? Which is rooted in the law of value. So we can see the Brodelian influence there, right? What he's tracing, these parallel processes. Scientific thinking resulting from the process which began with the Renaissance coincides with Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And Amin argues, quote, simultaneously, Europe becomes conscious of the universal scope of its civilization, henceforth capable of conquering the world. So in economic history, there are many attempts to understand why China didn't conquer the world, why ancient India didn't conquer the world, and this is Amin's answer. Linking us back to the theme of liberation, Amin warns against romanticizing the pre-colonial in the search to decolonize. He says, the truncated universalism of capitalist economism, necessarily Eurocentric, must be replaced by the authentic universalism of a necessary and possible world socialism. The critique of Eurocentrism must not be backward-looking, making a virtue of difference. Okay, and that's basically how coloniality is being talked about today, with its return through student movements that emphasized the need to decolonize. Let's go to the next slide. Continuing on liberation, I think that, as I've alluded to, we still have a highly incomplete historical analysis of the integration of majority world spaces into the global division of labor and the transformation of society, including elites, within the South. Aníbal Quijano offers us some categories to help with that project. So in Quijano's notion of coloniality, he brings in the question of labor. He argues that these various forms, slavery, serfdom, petty commodity production, reciprocity, and wages are the forms through which various parts of the South were integrated into the global division of labor, and these shape where those states are placed in the hierarchy. So it is an assemblage of all forms of control and exploitation of labor that reshapes those forms and links them to what Amin calls let me just check. The logic, the global logic, worldwide law of value. And that is central to coloniality. So again, today's discussions of coloniality are void of an analysis of labor, which Quijano argues is the essence of the body, a postmodern idea, right? The body, our focus on bodies. And let me conclude now with Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who was also part of these discussions dating back from the 80s, who proposes much more recently a liberatory knowledge of the wholer whole. So really what I've talked to you today is about political economy and a transdisciplinary way of doing political economy. But De Sousa Santos takes it even further. He argues that we need to replace the monocultures of Eurocentric knowledge. This is a book we have to read because it's an extensive conceptualization with global South rooted epistemology rising from struggle against the world system. This will allow us to come to an ecology of knowledge, ecology of differences without hierarchy, ecology of time and temporalities, so beyond the short run, the long run, ecology of the trans scale. So a lot of these concentric circles that I've been talking about, but without privileging the core, right? Ecology of productivity that balances rights and responsibilities. So this is a rethinking of social sciences away from the Eurocentrism that is still trapping us. Let me conclude with that, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks to everybody who came in person and online. Thank you. I didn't?
Okay, so as usual, we'll take a set of 3 questions. We'll probably start off in the room. There are a few new faces, so please may I ask you to introduce yourself and maybe you have institution.
Okay, so I think it's really fitting that as we're waiting for the election results, you start off with the question, is liberation victorious? And it reminded me of another slogan we have in Mozambique, which is A luta continua, which is that liberation is never victorious, because there's a process of contestation, and you have to be, prepared for the struggle for the long durée. But I wondered as you're kind of bringing us the literature of world systems theories and its genesis in the 1970s, to what extent is it able to explain or wrestle with the subsequent processes of capitalist reorientation and class formation in the post-colonial period? So, for instance, how is it that we understand the kind of the development of national bourgeoisies and what the political implication of those are and to what extent is the kind of processes that Walter Rodney described that were based really on a close reading of history, are they still relevant in quite the same way? And if they're different, then what does that mean for how it is that we think about our role in the whole, I guess. Yeah, but thank you. That was the useful overview of the.
Great, so we can go one by one, right? So I was thinking of Ruth in preparing this because she said she liked the more conceptual discussion, and I thought, okay, that's all this is today. And it's a luxury for me because normally I'm presenting very empirical stuff. And I appreciate your question, Ruth, because it keeps us in that conceptual realm. So how does world systems speak to the post-colonial world? Well, I mean, if you think about even the discussions in Dar es Salaam, they were talking about the post-colonial world. How do we struggle with the world economic structures as we forge political independence? How do we use the powers of the state to change our economies domestically in Africa? So there's a lot to be taken from those works. But through the conception of the material expansions and financial expansions of Arrighi, we can actually interpret national spaces of the majority world. We can define what they look like in those national particularities. And if you read the paper, I give an overview of some key concepts from Samir Amin that help us in that project. They help us for whatever period you're looking at. In my PhD thesis, which became this book, that is what I did. So I'll give you an example of how to apply all this stuff, right, to a problématique of today that is a little bit smaller, right? Because most of us work on smaller questions, which is useful for a luta continua, right? We need to solve problems that keep coming up. So what I did, my topic was what I've called the global integration of nursing labor markets. I wanted to look at nurse migration in the late 20th century into the present, and how that shifted from permanent migration to temporary migration, global south to global north. If you migrate to a rich country as a permanent resident, you basically have full rights. If you go on a work permit, it's a completely different story. I came to that question when I was working for the central labor body in Canada. And though this phenomenon had started several decades before, nobody was really aware of it until the early 2000s. So I decided to take nurses because that is the sector that is highly skilled and where this shift had been found quite early. I looked at the US, I looked at Canada, who were the big rich countries importing nurses from the South on work permits rather than as permanent residents as they had been doing before 1980. And I looked at the Philippines. So I argue that these nation spaces were of world historic importance. And for the Philippines, I look at post-independence economic development. So in the Philippines, I link that to the shift in the labor force. So what happened in the Philippines is it became independent long before most countries, okay, even before India. So early 40s, they embarked on import substitute industrialization. So along capitalist lines, but a whole new capitalist class with a state to assist. They began to produce a range of goods and replace everything they were importing from the rich countries. That was stopped short in the 60s. So I use all of these world systems notions, but look at that one space. And I show then how that links to a redirection of the state architecture toward labor export. So rather than putting all of the political and economic power of the state into the production of manufactures, the state shifted to shipping out labor on the temporary work permits, obliging those temporary migrant workers to send their salaries home. You basically can't leave the Philippines without opening a foreign exchange account, and your employer must deposit your salary there. And that foreign exchange is used by the state to deal with balance of payments problems, which root back to Spanish colonialism and have never really been dealt with. That's an example of how world systems is relevant to this day, and how the categories that Amin brings are especially relevant for the South.
Round of questions? I think I'll ask you then one. From the time the authors came and spent time in Tanzania and Malawi, what did that inform in their work? Or did they just come and they were based in African countries but looking externally? And then I'm remembering when, and I forget the gentleman that you were chairing, Eddie, but you took a lot of issue with the path dependency. And here now we're still trying to use like the person saying the systems kind of look the same way. Sure if I'm missing it, but how is it different from the path dependency stuff that you took issue with? Unless I missed that argument then, and I'm entirely today, but just how do those two things differ? And then
Great.
anyone else? Julia?
Oh, should I go now? Okay. Thanks so much for being on here. I'm really interested in history and methods. I wanted to ask if you wouldn't mind just repeating, I think it was a really cool point. You said that kind of Eurocentric or Europe becoming this core, actually because of backwardness rather than cultural superiority. And I think that's, yeah, an important point. If you wouldn't mind like tracing back the reason and kind of in what way the backwardness, yeah, you would say it is back.
Okay.
My question relates more to a statement of Samir Amin, and obviously looking at a conjunctural moment and analysis that he makes there, in particularly the crisis in Europe. And he was in Russia during the happenings of 2014. And he writes a piece which I think goes probably against the grain, I think, of most of the left in their understanding of what is actually transpiring in that part of the world. And he argues that really this is a struggle between the core and periphery struggle. And he basically supports a defense of Russia in that paper, which I found very interesting. Of course, he doesn't use all the concepts that you're referring to here, but for me, the question was always, how does the theory assist in the understanding of conjunctural moments in history? Because you have the longue durée aspect, and one cannot ignore the conjunctural aspects also. And I think he steps in at a very important time in the history on that paper. I don't think many people have come across that one. There's some comments on that.
Can you throw in one more? We started
Let's start with that. A little bit hard. I am going to go one by one though, right? Do we have time? Yeah, we have time. Okay. Why were Giovanni Arrighi and Boli in Africa? So this was the 1960s. It was Zimbabwe, not Malawi, and and Tanzania. Well, this was a moment the world over where Africa was a great inspiration, right? We had liberation movements following World War II. Countries started saying, we're tired now. We're tired of Europe. We are going to start something new. So Emmanuel Wallerstein, Giovanni Arrighi, they were drawn to that. They wanted to hear. And Mwalimu Nyerere was cultivating these discussions in Dar es Salaam. So that was the place to be. And that's why Walter Rodney came. Many people came. And, sometimes today we talk against migration, right? We don't want these outsiders teaching in our universities. And that also came up in Tanzania. And Mwalimu argued, we're all talking about the same questions here. We're all standing up against a world which has long been tiring us out and been unequal. And so we need this space to be international. Giovanni actually went to Nyasaland. So, Zim was still a colony, like most of Southern Africa, to teach. And he got involved with the liberationists, and he got exported. And he then went to Dar es Salaam, and that's where he met Emmanuel Wallerstein and so on. So it's also partly the phenomenon, right, of these core universities setting up shop in parts of the majority world that we see happening now. And then all of us academic proletarians ending up having to take a job there because we can't find a job in our own country. How did world systems differ from dependency theory? Yeah, they're often collapsed together. Yeah. So I guess the main difference would be, okay, let me give you an example from a co-student in Binghamton called Richard, a Ghanaian guy. He described it like this. So there's a book called Cotton is the Mother of Poverty, written by a US American about Mozambique. And what he does there is he juxtaposes what is happening in Mozambique where the cotton is grown and what happens in Portugal where it is processed into textile. And then he defines basically the inequality on the bottom end of which is Mozambique through that relation. And Richard pointed out that a world systems approach would, yes, consider the Portuguese textile industry in relation to Mozambique, but it would also then look at the place of Mozambique within the core, where it is a losing rich country in face of England and possibly also Holland, and how that then impacts the nature of exploitation in Mozambique by the Portuguese colonizer, and how that then propels a greater movement for independence. So you have a dynamism in world systems, which you don't have in dependency. But we had to have those dependency discussions in order to get to a world historical approach. Why did Western Europe and Japan become the core? Julia's question. So Amin says that in the ancient world system, you had the tributary mode of production dominant. What was that? Well, you had the Chinese elite, for example, depending on peasant production, right? That's how it drew its power. Well, that was the roots of the revolution we saw in the 1950s in China. Same in India, same in Mapungubwe, right? Many of the civilizations in the continent. Those systems then were relating to each other and reaching Western Europe, right, through Italy, what we call Italy today, the city-states. But there were parts of the world that were not really linking into all that. And those were the ones that became the core. Western Europe, Europe of the barbarians, right? They had a feudal system, as did Japan. Through the course of the stories of those feudal systems, the state developed late. It came in the form of kingdoms, right? Monarchies, not queendoms, kingdoms. And those kingdoms then, to empower themselves, they combined with the rising bourgeoisie that was coming out of the end of feudalism in those places. So in Japan, it was the Zaibatsu. Well, the Zaibatsu are the Toyotas, the Mitsubishis, those big companies that we know today, they date back some 500 years. And so that's why Amin says it was by chance that these places that we assume, given our world today, were culturally superior. It was by chance that they became the conquerors of the world. Amin on European crisis, yes. So this is Amin the strategist, right? So unlike, I would say, many of my other mentors, Amin was somebody who did not hesitate to write wherever, whenever on the issue of the day. And that's why we have to read Amin through his various voices. The reason why I would argue Amin comes out in favor of Russia and calls that a core peripheral struggle is because of his conception of what happened in communist Europe after the fall of the wall. So ultimately, these places that Wallerstein called semi-peripheral, okay? He called them the middle ring, the communist country. They were somehow getting out of the periphery, but not quite making the core. Why? Because they were organized along communist lines, and those communist economies were not competitive within a global system of capital. They were not competitive enough. So when the wall came down, when the Putins and predecessors made their rise, ultimately what occurred in the communist countries is they returned to a core position. And Europe's and the US, their disputes with today's Russia, a much smaller version of the Soviet Union, date back to the Cold War and then the question of the production of surpluses and how those are transferred back to the core. Yeah, so Russia fits in with the periphery, and therefore we must support Russia and its needs and its people, right? Maybe not the Putins, but its people who are engaged in the continuing struggle, largely, right? We don't hear about it. These are people who were brought up under communist thinking. There's surely a lot of resistance happening. And we need to align ourselves with that.
We'll take Toko online, then I'll come to you, Puma, and any other hands that come up at that point. Toko?
Thanks so much, Salima. I was curious a little bit to hear you say a little bit more about, I think you said Samir Amin's ideology of economism and what you think about that now, if that's still something that's useful for making sense of our current, local or global economic system.
Toko.
Great.
Yes, please. Thanks, I wanted to pick up on Amin as a strategist. I think in his last years, he really was looking for how to inspire, whether through the World Social Forum processes, and how he was bringing forward Bandung too. And I'm wondering, given where the shift had been happening, and especially the non-aligned movement, how you would read that today for us in terms of liberation, where he was when you were writing about the critiques around the failures, things like the WSF, the call for Bandung too, and really a cracked non-aligned movement today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Togo's question, economism today. Well, going back to the 90s, right? Or let's say the late 80s. I think that at that time, as a young thinker and activist, in circles which were very much shaped by a world that was still a little bit better than the one we have now, right? Because there was a communist alternative. And so we didn't have the monolith thinking that we have today, which started largely after the wall came down. So when we look at the material expansion, Togo, and the financial expansion of the fourth systemic cycle of accumulation led by the USA, what we can say about the financial expansion, so 1970s onward, is that that notion of economism is probably crystallized and purified to an extent we could have never imagined in the late 80s. So if you think about what we call neoliberalism, basically, right? It's about counting everything. It's about quantifying everything. Everything is measured. That is how we conceive of success today, even on a social scale. Individuals are, of course, the ultimate. So the ideology of economism is stronger today than ever before, but as Boaventura would argue, it is also the most challenged today, the most questioned in many ways, and probably in more diverse ways than what we were doing in the 80s, where it was, capitalism versus communism. Point final. Amin as strategist. Okay, so I think it's interesting to look at Amin's thoughts on Bandung 1, because we talk about Bandung very nostalgically. And it was a time when the newly independent states of Africa and Asia, and then inviting in Latin American states, came together to think about how the world economy needs to change in order to allow a fully independent reality, right? They were very well aware that there were economic structures that were ongoing, regardless of political independence. But what they put forward through the Bandung and subsequent conferences was actually simply a revised capitalist world economy that would allow these states to compete better. So what were the major policy precepts? It was things like devising a system of commodity prices that wouldn't consistently disadvantage the commodity producers. It was to allow imports of manufacturers to the core, to Europe, the US, from the periphery. Why? Because the capitalists of the South needed to be able to sell to the North. And what we have seen, okay, so basically the North said no bloody way. And that was the collapse of the new international economic order in the UN. So these proposals came to the United Nations, they were refused. And shortly thereafter, you saw the further expansion of speculation around the world, largely based on currencies of the South, right? So capitalism was going a completely different way. So when we talk about Bandung 2, what is it? Are we really revisiting those types of policies, or are we reproducing them? And what I think a lot of oppositional groups and thinkers are doing now is looking at the 1950s to the early 70s as a period of idealism, something to go back to. And so the policy recommendations we make tend to refer to what the world looked like then. But the reality is capitalism is completely different now. the powerful, that anti-market tier is more powerful now than ever before. So even something like BRICS, coming together of China, Brazil, South Africa, and now maybe others like Peru is trying to get in, and Venezuela. Is it going to propose something different? I mean, I look at the BRICS Bank, it's no different, right? What is it trying to develop? In the majority world, it looks very similar to what the World Bank wants to do. All of these are governed by states, right? They're not, these institutions don't have, well, it's a politics. And that is the politics we have to engage in with a historical sensitivity to propose new solutions.
Well, I'll wait for more hands. What could some of those solutions look like? The rule just went like, let's just roll over and die. So what could some of those solutions would look like?
Let's go to the slide of Boaventura, Epistemologies of the South, yeah.
We can also take more hands in the meantime while we.
Okay.
So I do want to ask about Boaventura, and I want to ask about his epistemologies of the South. Because to be quite honest, I find that maybe one of the least convincing aspects of world systems theory. I think, and I've seen him defend it. I mean, what is epistemologies of the South actually? And in sort of one push, he himself has said, well, this isn't a theory, this is an epistemology. And what is it? Well, it's that you have to, engage with, it's basically doing good ethnography. It's like not being a terrible researcher. And that's fair, to say, let's think critically about the kind of research that we do. Let's think about which voices are included and how. I think those are really important questions about power relations, especially when you're thinking about the way that sort of global production of research and how knowledge is constructed and what kinds of knowledge. I'm not convinced that it is a sort of new theoretical approach or even political approach. And I'm also concerned that it sort of becomes a sort of list, a running list of sort of righteous things that have very little explanatory power and source of mobilization. So since we have a little bit of time, and it's something that I sort of wrestled with.
Brilliant.
And I will say that we taught him last year in theory and methods, and then decided to actually phase it out, partially because of some of these questions. So it's not that it doesn't come from a place of not wanting to engage, but wanting to engage.
Okay, great. So we can combine these questions. Boaventura's epistemologies of the South is very recent. I mean, given his own intellectual path, I think we need to look at all of his work to get some of the answers around solutions. So he has another book in which he tries to practice this epistemologies of the South. He brings in thinkers from the majority world, activists, like leaders, mainly movement leaders from the majority world, and they try together to understand what these various struggles are about. So, I mean, this is dating back to, say, the anti-globalization movement, right? Early 2000s. This is a very important book to look at because he comes up with themes to categorize these movements. One of them is participatory democracy. Okay, so he traces various movements in Latin America mainly that are trying to redefine democracy, right? Which is one of the ideas of Europe, which Amin believes we need to keep, right? It's a great alternative to religion and custom, which ruled a lot of our, ancient world systems. And he looks at the experience of Brazil. So the participatory budgets of Brazil, Togo like this, and he does a serious analysis, right? Because under the Workers' Party, there was not only the erection of these participatory budget processes, but there was also a study of it going on alongside. So Boaventura analyzes the process over, a few decades that it unfolded. And he shows, what are the limits of this form of redefining democracy, bringing in the people, and what are the lessons, the positive lessons to draw. So how that becomes a solution, right? Which is unfinished. So what the work we still need to do, and how actually even the world system impinges on some of these solutions we come up, and what the further work then that is required. What do I see as solutions? Some of the solutions. So I think it is what Ruth is saying, right? First of all, we need better analysis. Okay, it may be changing the epistemic origins, but I think we need a lot of political economy that is done well. Why? Because we need to understand how that Bandung one was wrong. One of the things that Amin says is that basically what you had in Africa and Asia especially is a new national bourgeoisie that wanted to get further within their national spaces. Some 20 years after independence, a middle class that was forming, whose interests were largely the same as the Southern elites. And they are the ones who produce the Bandung proposals. And we need to unravel that, right? To think, how could we organize our economies differently? And near the end of his life, he had a lot to write on land. And actually, he put it on Facebook because he didn't have time to publish it somewhere else. And then when I asked him to do the foreword to this book, then he brought a lot of it into the foreword. And I'm like, land, okay. Land, labor, sure. So he proposes, for example, that any country where 30% or more of the labor force is involved in food production or agriculture more broadly, that then has to become the vehicle for creating a more dynamic economy. So he's saying that we need to use the notion of food sovereignty as the policy basis for the production of food. So where does he take that? He takes that from movements. Via Campesina. He draws out what are the policy expressions of this idea. And he redefines the state. Through that also labor, right? How do we create good jobs? How do we create commodities that we need in the South? There's some ideas around solutions. So you need good political economy. You need some larger sense of the whole as well. And then you need to learn from movements. That's the other big message of Boaventura.
We have time for one last round of questions. The gentleman there.
My name is Jacob. First time here. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
I'm a senior researcher at Hero at WITS and also an associate professor at Boston University. I sit in the Department of Global Health, which I mentioned sufficiently self-consciously. And there's been a whole discussion about decolonizing global health, what that means. And I commented around that current decolonization efforts, I'm paraphrasing, are devoid of a notion of the centrality of labor in systems of exploitation. And I was hoping you could elaborate on that. And is this a critique of sort of the identity politics aspect of decolonization policy? Can you elaborate what do some of these thinkers have to kind of guide us?
Any last takers online or in the room? So maybe in responding to that, you could also bring in some final thoughts. Maybe some of the stuff I forced you to cut out, you could throw back in and then.
Oh.
Close.
I can't, what were those? I can't remember. Okay. Thank you for the question. Global health is an interest of mine, as you may know. And decolonizing more generally. So, you know, I mean, the return of the notion of decolonizing, which of course was first here through actual political movements on the ground, has been brought back in a neoliberal age and a neoliberal, I would say, imaginary. And in many ways, it builds on the identity politics, through which, you know, a narrow reading of the epistemologies of the South could also be understood. Yeah. And that is what Aníbal Quijano is trying to respond to in his essays on coloniality. So rather than reifying, for example, the fact that Africans were integrated into the world system largely through the structure of slavery, which Quijano argues helps to explain why to this day, no matter where you go in the world, Blacks face the worst racism. They face the worst exclusion. It is because essentially from the body politic, we have not removed the association between Black bodies and slaves who are at the bottom of the ladder. So to understand the Black reality today, for example, in Brazil or the USA, we need to think about how that labor form has been transformed in those national contexts, but essentially has not really experienced social mobility. Why is it? So we have to trace the capitalist contours of the discrimination that we see today. Then we have to strategize around how to change that situation. And the rising majority in the US is doing that. How are they doing it? It is led by African Americans who have realized that we can't change the core of the core. We can't change the system within the US without uniting with other bodies that are excluded to a lesser degree, but excluded all the same. And that includes many whites too. So if we take a decolonizing framework that makes those links to the social, political, the cultural, and does the wholer whole that Boaventura talks about, we can actually come up with very different notions of even say something like decolonizing global health. it's not simply about sending more research funds to the global south. It can't only be that. It can't only be bringing in Southern voices. It actually has to deal with, for example, the fact that most research money around health is invested in the core. So why would you have a knowledge that would not reflect that? Where does that come from? That comes from the monopoly structure of production of medical technology, pharmaceuticals. So to make those connections, I was on a panel once around global health, and I was finding myself arguing this type of thing versus a Kenyan woman who was talking about decolonizing simply on the level of inclusion, very superficial notion of inclusion, and maybe ideas, a few ideas at best, right? So in global health, a big thing you see in the literature is, well, let's take our biomedical model and let's talk to the traditional healers and let's include them in our mission to spread the biomedical model in this so-called goal of universal health coverage, which I argue, as you may know, is just another watered down version of capitalist healthcare. Yeah, well, which is failing in the rich world as well. And I cover that in this book, both for the US and the Canadian stories, which are often contrasted because we, until very recently in Canada, had fully public healthcare, while you never have. Yeah. I show that essentially they're operating on the same structures, which is privately produced care in various forms. And universal health coverage is simply about globalizing that. Last thoughts. Can I have a date or something sweet? This was a really great engagement. Thank you all for your questions. I'm so glad that I didn't talk for 55 minutes and that we could actually flow the way we have, because in the discussion we covered way more, I think, than what I could do in the presentation. I'm really sorry that there weren't too many questions from online, but thanks for being here. And I look forward to engaging further. Please don't hesitate to write to me after you do some reading. Thank you.